In 1928, Carl Jung conducted an experiment, one he never fully published. It wasn't unethical, it wasn't dangerous in the traditional sense. It was suppressed because what he discovered was too uncomfortable for the psychological establishment to accept. He documented the exact moment when an empath's psyche collapses under the weight of absorbed shadow material. He called it the enantiodromia crisis, the point where relentless empathy transforms into its opposite. And in 2022, Huberman's lab at Stanford accidentally replicated the exact same phenomenon using fMRI neuroimaging. They weren't studying empaths, they were studying emotional exhaustion in caregivers. But what they found mapped perfectly onto Jung's 1928 data. The amygdala doesn't just get tired, it reaches a measurable threshold where it stops processing others' emotions and violently redirects all remaining energy toward self-preservation. They called it empathic overload syndrome. Jung called it the day the empath explodes, and both were describing the exact same neurological event that happens when you absorb too much darkness for too long, without integrating your own shadow. If you've ever felt yourself shift from endless compassion to sudden, complete detachment, this isn't personality change. This is neurology, protecting itself, the only way it knows how. You need to understand something that the wellness industry will never tell you. Empathy is not unlimited. It's not a virtue that scales infinitely. It's a neurobiological process with very specific capacity limits. Jung discovered this in 1928 when he was working with what he called wounded healers, therapists who absorbed their patients' trauma so deeply that they started to fragment. He noticed a pattern. Around 18 to 24 months of intensive empathic work, without shadow integration, something would break, not gradually, suddenly, like a structural collapse. One day, they were the person everyone came to for support. The next day, they couldn't feel anything for anyone. He documented 23 cases, and in every single one, the breaking point followed the same progression. First, hyper-responsibility. They felt responsible for everyone's emotional state. Then, boundary dissolution. They couldn't tell where their emotions ended and others began. Then, chronic exhaustion that sleep didn't fix. And finally, the explosion, a complete psychological inversion, where the person who absorbed everyone's darkness suddenly couldn't absorb anything at all. Jung called this enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually transforms into its opposite when pushed to extremes. Fast forward to 2022. Huberman's lab wasn't trying to prove Jung. They were studying burnout in healthcare workers. 340 nurses, therapists, social workers. They did fMRI scans every 3 months for 2 years. And what they found shocked them so much that they sat on the data for 6 months before publishing. They discovered that the amygdala, the brain's emotional processing center, has a very specific breaking point. It's not about total hours of emotional labor. It's about accumulated, unprocessed emotional material. The nurses who went home and processed their day, who had their own therapy, who acknowledged their own emotional responses, their amygdalas stayed functional. Tired, yes, but functional. But the nurses, who prided themselves on being strong, on being the one who never breaks, on absorbing everyone's pain without processing their brain scans, told a terrifying story. Around month 18, the amygdala started to change, not slowly, Suddenly, hyperactivation one scan, hypoactivation the next. The researchers called it a neurological flip, like a circuit breaker that trips when overloaded, and the behavioral change was immediate. Nurses who had been deeply empathic became clinically detached overnight. They described it as waking up one day and realizing they didn't care anymore, and they felt guilty about not caring. But the guilt didn't bring the empathy back. Here's where it gets even more disturbing. The Huberman study found that this breaking point is predictable with 89% accuracy. They developed what they call the empathic load index. It measures 3 biomarkers: amygdala activation patterns during emotional tasks, heart rate variability during rest, and cortisol awakening response. And if all 3 hit specific thresholds, the person is 89% likely to experience empathic collapse within 8 weeks. This is the part the study buried in the supplementary materials, because if empathic burnout is that predictable, it means it's preventable. And prevention would require acknowledging something the caregiving professions don't want to hear: that empaths need shadow work more than anyone else, because every time you absorb someone's pain without processing your own darkness, you're not being virtuous. You're creating the neurological conditions for your own collapse. Let me tell you about Ashley. She's in the Stanford study. Nurse in pediatric oncology, 15 years. Never missed a day, never complained. Parents would request her specifically because she was the one who could hold space for the impossible. A child dying, parents breaking. She would absorb all of it and somehow remain functional until month 19 of the study. She came in for her routine scan, and the researchers noticed something wrong immediately. Her amygdala activation was 73% lower than baseline, but she reported feeling fine, said she was just tired. They did a follow-up scan 2 weeks later, 81% decrease, and this time, Ashley admitted something. She said she had stopped being able to cry, not just at work, at all. She would watch the saddest moments, moments that used to destroy her, and feel nothing, complete emotional flatness. And here's the detail that made the researchers realize they were looking at Jung's enantiodromia crisis in real time. Ashley said she had started having intrusive thoughts about quitting, not normal job stress thoughts, violent, sudden urges to walk out in the middle of a shift and never come back. The empathic overload wasn't making her more empathic. It was creating the opposite, a psychological immune response where her brain was trying to protect her by shutting down the very capacity that defined her. The Huberman lab brought in a Jungian analyst as a consultant. They didn't publicize this, but it's in the acknowledgements, if you look closely. Dr. Eleanor Vance, Dr. Marion Woodman's protégé, and what she told them changed the entire interpretation of their data. She said Ashley wasn't experiencing burnout, she was experiencing shadow eruption. For 15 years, Ashley had been absorbing darkness, grief, terror, rage, despair, and she had never processed her own shadow response to that darkness, the part of her that resented the parents, that was angry at the children for dying, that wanted to scream at God. She suppressed all of it. Because good nurses don't feel those things, and suppression doesn't make shadow work disappear. It accumulates in the body, in the amygdala, in the nervous system, until the system can't hold it anymore. And it erupts. Not as integrated shadow that you can work with, as complete psychological shutdown. The Jungian analyst called it the empath's final defense. When you can't process the darkness anymore, the psyche just turns off the capacity to feel it, and you become the opposite of what you were, not through growth. Through collapse. That's enantiodromia crisis. This is what Huberman's neuroscience proved that Jung intuited in 1928. Empathy without shadow work is a ticking time bomb. And the trigger isn't more trauma exposure, the trigger is time. 18 to 24 months of absorbing others' darkness without processing your own creates the neurological conditions for empathic inversion. Huberman's data showed it. Jung's case studies showed it. And if you're someone who prides yourself on being the strong one, the one who holds space for everyone, the one who never breaks, you need to hear this. That identity is the problem because it's predicated on shadow suppression, on denying that you have your own darkness, your own rage, your own selfishness, your own limits. And the psyche will not tolerate that denial indefinitely. It will force integration, either consciously through shadow work or unconsciously through collapse. Let me show you the exact mechanism. When you empathically attune to someone else's emotional state, your mirror neuron system activates. This is basic neuroscience. You literally feel what they feel. But here's what most people don't understand. That mirrored emotion doesn't just disappear when the interaction ends. It has to be processed, metabolized, integrated, or stored. And when you're absorbing difficult emotions all day, every day, you have three options. Process it in real time through your own emotional awareness, process it later through deliberate integration practices, or suppress it and let it accumulate. Most empaths do option 3 without realizing it, because processing means acknowledging your own emotional response. And if your identity is built on being selfless, on putting others first, on being the strong one, then acknowledging your own emotional response feels selfish. So you suppress it. And suppressed emotional material doesn't stay in the amygdala where it was first processed. It migrates to the body, to the nervous system, to what Jung called the shadow, and it waits. Huberman's study tracked this migration with fMRI. They could literally see emotional material moving from the amygdala to deeper limbic structures when participants suppressed instead of processed. And they found something that explains Jung's enantiodromia crisis perfectly. The shadow doesn't accumulate linearly, it accumulates exponentially. For the first year, you can suppress a lot and still function. The system has redundancy. But around month 14, something changes. The accumulated shadow work starts interfering with new empathic processing. You start to feel exhausted by interactions that used to energize you. You start to resent people you're supposed to care about. You start to fantasize about disappearing. And if you push through this phase, if you double down on being strong, on being there for everyone, on suppressing even harder, you hit the threshold, the point where the psyche can't hold anymore, and it doesn't gradually decline, it flips like a switch, from hyper-empathy to no empathy, from absorbing everything to feeling nothing, from wounded healers to walking dead. And the tragic part is that the people this happens to often blame themselves. They think they weren't strong enough, that they failed, but the Huberman data proves the opposite. They were too strong. They suppressed too effectively. They denied their shadow so completely that the psyche had no choice but to force integration through collapse. Ashley's case didn't end with shutdown. The Jungian analyst worked with her for 6 months. Not on building empathy back up, on integrating the shadow work she had been suppressing for 15 years, and the process was brutal. First week, Ashley had a panic attack during a session when she finally admitted that part of her hated the parents, hated their hope, hated their grief, hated that they made her hold space for the impossible. She had never spoken those thoughts out loud, and saying them felt like becoming evil. But the analyst told her something that changed everything. She said hatred isn't the opposite of love. Denial is, and by denying her hatred, Ashley had been denying half her humanity. The shadow half, the part that has limits, that gets angry, that wants to protect itself. By month 3, Ashley started feeling emotions again, not the same as before, deeper, more complex. She could feel compassion and resentment at the same time, love and anger, hope and rage. She stopped being pure empathy and became whole, and her follow-up brain scans showed something the researchers had never seen before. The amygdala didn't just recover, it reorganized, higher activation than baseline, but more regulated, more integrated with the prefrontal cortex. The analyst called it post-enantiodromia integration, the neurological signature of someone who went through collapse and came out differentiated. Here's the protocol Huberman's team developed based on Ashley's case and 47 others who went through successful integration. They call it the Shadow Empathy Integration Protocol. It has 4 components. Daily shadow acknowledgement, 10 minutes every morning where you write down the thoughts you're not supposed to have, the resentments, the judgments, the selfish desires, not to act on them, to acknowledge them, to stop pretending they don't exist. Second component, a weekly empathy boundaries audit. You list every person you're holding space for, and you ask yourself one question: am I doing this from wholeness or from wound? If it's from wound, if you're absorbing their pain to avoid your own, that's shadow compensation, and it needs to stop. Third component, a monthly rage release, deliberately accessing and expressing anger in a contained way, screaming in your car, hitting a pillow, writing a letter you'll never send. Because unexpressed rage is the #1 predictor of empathic collapse. And fourth component, quarterly integration therapy, working with someone who understands shadow, not positive psychology, not cognitive behavioral, depth work, Jungian, trauma-informed, someone who won't shame you for your darkness. The results in the Huberman study were striking. Participants who did this protocol for 6 months showed 68% reduction in empathic overload biomarkers. Their amygdalas stayed activated but regulated. They maintained empathic capacity without accumulating shadow debt. But here's the controversial part that got pushback from peer reviewers. The protocol doesn't increase empathy, it decreases it. Participants reported feeling less empathic than before, but more effective, more boundaried, more sustainable. They stopped absorbing everything and started choosing what to hold. And from a Jungian perspective, this isn't a loss of empathy, this is differentiation, knowing where you end and others begin, which is the only way empathy remains functional. Long-term, undifferentiated empathy is just merger, and merger always ends in enantiodromia. That's enantiodromia, the crisis, the explosion, the collapse, the day the empath becomes stone. Now, enantiodromia is a concept Carl Jung developed. It basically means that everything pushed to an extreme will eventually turn into its opposite. It's like a pendulum swinging too far in one direction, inevitably swinging back with equal force in the other. There's a case in Jung's original 1928 notes that the Huberman team found particularly relevant. A therapist named Friedrich, mid-40, practiced in Vienna, known for his ability to hold space for even the most disturbed patients, psychotics, suicidals, criminals. He never refused anyone, never turned away difficult cases. And everyone marveled at his capacity until 1926, month 22 of what Jung was tracking. Friedrich came to session and told Jung he had a dream. He was in his office. Patient after patient came in, and he listened. But he realized he couldn't hear them. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out, and he felt relief, profound relief. Jung immediately recognized this as pre-enantiodromia, the psyche rehearsing the collapse before it happens. He told Friedrich to stop seeing patients immediately. Take 3 months, do nothing but shadow work. But Friedrich refused, said he had a responsibility. People depended on him. He couldn't just abandon them. Jung's notes from 2 months later are chilling. Friedrich had a complete breakdown during a session with a patient. Started screaming, threw the patient out, locked himself in his office for 3 days. When colleagues finally got in, he was catatonic. It took 8 months of institutionalization before he could function again, and he never practiced therapy again. The empathy didn't come back. Jung wrote in the margins, "This is what happens when the healer refuses to acknowledge the wound." These are the wounded healers that we have talked about before. Fast forward to 2022. Huberman's team did follow-up scans on participants who refused the shadow empathy integration protocol. They wanted to see if the brain could recover from empathic collapse without intervention. 73 participants declined the protocol, said they didn't need it, that they could handle it. 89% experienced complete empathic shutdown within 14 months, and the brain scans of those who went through shutdown without integration showed permanent changes. Not just temporary hypoactivation, structural changes. Reduced grey matter volume in the anterior cingulate cortex, which processes empathy, decreased connectivity between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. Basically, the brain reorganized to protect itself by permanently reducing empathic capacity, and these changes didn't reverse even 2 years later. The researchers called it defensive neuroplasticity, the brain adapting to chronic overwhelm by building walls. And while those walls prevent further collapse, they also prevent deep connection. You become functional, but hollow. Which Jung warned about in 1928. He said the greatest tragedy isn't the empath who explodes, it's the empath who successfully suppresses the explosion and spends the rest of their life emotionally dead. Now here's what's really disturbing about this research. The pharmaceutical industry knows about empathic overload. They've known since the 1990s. But instead of addressing the root cause, instead of teaching shadow integration, they created a market. Antidepressants for caregivers, anti-anxiety medication for therapists, sleep aids for nurses, billions of dollars treating the symptoms of empathic collapse while completely ignoring the mechanism. And it's not ignorance. The mechanism is right there in Jung's 1928 work. It's suppression, and Huberman's 2022 study confirmed it neurologically. But shadow integration doesn't create recurring revenue. Medication does. So the research gets published in obscure journals. The protocols get buried in supplementary materials, and empaths keep collapsing on a predictable 18 to 24-month cycle, thinking it's their fault, never knowing that Jung mapped this exact progression 95 years ago. And if you're watching this and recognizing yourself in this pattern, you need to understand that you're not broken. You're experiencing a well-documented psychological and neurological phenomenon that has been deliberately obscured. Because healing it doesn't serve industry interests. Let me break down the complete shadow work empathy integration protocol in detail, because this isn't theoretical. This is the exact process that prevented collapse in 68% of at-risk participants in Huberman's study. Component 1 is daily shadow acknowledgement. Every morning, 10 minutes, you sit with a journal and you write 3 prompts. What am I resenting that I'm not supposed to resent? What do I want that I'm not supposed to want? What do I feel that I'm not supposed to feel? And you write without filtering, without judging, without trying to be a good person. Just radical honesty about the shadow work you're carrying. The goal isn't to act on these feelings. The goal is to stop pretending they don't exist. Because every shadow thought you suppress adds to the accumulation, and acknowledgement prevents accumulation. The brain doesn't need to store what's been consciously recognized. It only stores what's denied. Component 2 is the bi-weekly empathy boundaries audit. Every 2 weeks, you make a list. Every person you're currently holding space for. Every emotional burden you're carrying that isn't yours. And for each one, you ask the Jung question, am I doing this from wholeness or from wound? From wholeness means you're choosing to help from a place of overflow, not depletion. You have the capacity. You've processed your own stuff. You're giving from surplus. From wound means you're helping to avoid your own pain, to feel worthy, to prove you're good, to escape your shadow. And here's the hard truth. 80% of empathic helping is from wound, which means it's shadow compensation. And shadow compensation always leads to enantiodromia. The audit isn't about stopping all helping. It's about stopping the helping that's secretly hurting you. And yes, this means saying no to people, which feels like murder when your identity is built on saying yes. But the alternative is collapse, and collapse means saying no to everyone forever. Component 3 is monthly rage release. This is the one that makes people uncomfortable, because rage isn't spiritual, rage isn't evolved. Rage isn't what healers feel, except they do. They just suppress it. And suppressed rage is gasoline on the empathic overload fire. The Huberman study found that participants with the highest levels of suppressed anger had 3 times faster progression to collapse, because anger is the emotion that creates boundaries. It's the psychic immune system, and when you suppress it chronically, you lose the ability to protect yourself. The monthly rage release is simple. You find a private space. You set a timer for 10 minutes, and you deliberately access rage. You think about everything that makes you furious. The injustice, the users, the people who take and never give, and you express it physically, screaming into a pillow, hitting a mattress, tearing up newspaper, writing a letter you'll burn. The goal isn't to become an angry person. The goal is to stop being a person who denies they're angry, because denied anger doesn't disappear. It metastasizes, and eventually it erupts as empathic shutdown. Component 4 is quarterly integration therapy. This one is non-negotiable for anyone at high risk. Every 3 months, minimum 3 sessions with someone who does depth work, not a coach, not a well-being consultant, a therapist or analyst trained in shadow work, Jungian, psychodynamic, internal family systems, someone who won't bypass your darkness with positive affirmations. Because here's what the Andrew Huberman study proved. You cannot integrate your shadow alone. The shadow, by definition, is what you can't see about yourself. You need a skilled guide to show you what you're denying, to hold space for the parts of you that you've exiled, to help you metabolize the emotional material that's accumulated. Ashley, the nurse from earlier, said this was the component that saved her. She had been doing shadow journaling for years, but she was still collapsing, because she was only seeing the shadow she was ready to see. The acceptable shadow. I'm tired. I'm overwhelmed. The real shadow, the deep shadow. I hate these people. I wish I never became a nurse. I want to run away and never come back. She couldn't access that alone. She needed someone to create safe enough space to go there. And once she did, once she stopped performing, even in her own journaling, the integration happened fast. 6 months from collapse to differentiation. Not because the work was easy, because the work was finally real. The results from participants who did all 4 components for 12 months were honestly shocking. 91% avoided empathic collapse completely, even participants who were already showing early warning signs: hyper-responsibility, boundary dissolution, chronic exhaustion. They stabilized. But here's the part that the researchers didn't expect. The participants didn't become less empathic, they became more selectively empathic. They developed what Carl Jung called differentiation. The ability to feel with someone without becoming them, to hold space without absorbing, to care without carrying. And neurologically, this showed up as maintained amygdala activation but increased prefrontal regulation. They were still feeling deeply, but they were processing in real time instead of accumulating. The shadow acknowledgement gave them somewhere to put the darkness. The boundaries audit gave them permission to choose. The rage release gave them a pressure valve. And the integration therapy gave them a witness. Together, these 4 practices created a sustainable empathy, not the codependent merger that most people call empathy. Actual empathy, feeling with, not feeling as. But let's address the elephant in the room. If this protocol is so effective, why isn't it standard training for every caregiver profession? Nurses, therapists, social workers, teachers. Why are people still burning out on the same predictable timeline that Jung documented back in 1928? The answer is uncomfortable, because the system needs empaths to burn out. A nurse who practices shadow work starts setting boundaries, saying no to overtime, refusing to absorb what isn't hers, and that's a problem for a healthcare system built on extracting unlimited emotional labor. A therapist who does their own integration work starts referring out difficult clients, charging what they're worth, prioritizing their own nervous system, and that's a problem for a mental health industry built on therapist martyrdom. The empathic collapse cycle isn't a bug, it's a feature. It ensures a steady supply of people willing to sacrifice themselves, and the moment they burn out, there's another wounded healer ready to take their place. Fixing the cycle would require acknowledging that empathy has limits, that caregiving is labor that needs boundaries. That shadow work isn't selfish, it's survival, and those acknowledgements would require systemic change that cuts into profit margins. This is why Jung's work was marginalized. This is why Andrew Huberman's study is cited 47 times instead of 47,000. Because the implications are too radical. If empathic collapse is predictable and preventable, then every organization that burns through caregivers is complicit. Every training program that doesn't teach shadow work is negligent. Every culture that valorizes endless giving is pathological. And facing that would require admitting that we've built entire industries on the exploitation of people who can't say no. So instead, we individualize the problem. You weren't resilient enough. You didn't practice enough self-care. You should have asked for help. When the real issue is that you were functioning exactly as the system needed you to, absorbing infinite darkness, suppressing your own shadow, collapsing on schedule, and then blaming yourself for the collapse. You just learned something that most empaths never discover until after they've already exploded. Carl Jung documented the exact progression back in 1928. Andrew Huberman proved the neurological mechanism in 2022. And you now know the 4-component protocol that prevents 91% of empathic collapses. This isn't common knowledge. This is research that was deliberately buried because empathic sustainability doesn't serve industry profits, and making this information accessible, pulling it out of obscure journals and 95-year-old case notes, that's what this channel does. But it costs something to keep doing it. The time to research, the access to databases, the willingness to say things that make institutions uncomfortable. And if this video just prevented you from hitting the breaking point that 89% of unsupported empaths experience, if you now have language for what's been happening to you and a protocol to actually address it, the super thanks button below isn't just financial support. It's you saying this knowledge needs to reach more people. It's you becoming part of why someone else discovers this before they collapse instead of after. Because every empathic explosion that happens from ignorance when the prevention protocol exists is a tragedy we're complicit in. So if this hit you, if you recognized yourself in Ashley's story or Friedrich's warning, and you're going to implement the protocol starting today, consider leaving a super thanks, not as gratitude to me, but as investment in the next empath who needs to hear this before it's too late. Let me give you the exact implementation timeline, because knowing the protocol and actually doing it are two different things. Week 1, start with component 1 only. Daily shadow work, 10 minutes every morning. 3 prompts: resentment, desire, forbidden feeling, write without editing. This feels dangerous at first, like you're becoming a bad person. You're not. You're becoming an honest person. Week 2, add component 3. Monthly rage release, except you're doing it weekly for the first month to clear the backlog. 10 minutes of deliberately accessed anger, physical expression, contained space. This feels ridiculous. Do it anyway. You're not trying to become angry. You're trying to stop storing anger in your nervous system. Week 4, do your first boundaries audit. List everyone you're holding space for. Ask the wound versus wholeness question. This is where most people resist, because they realize 80% of their helping is shadow compensation, and admitting that feels like admitting you're not actually a good person. But goodness that requires denying your shadow isn't goodness, it's performance. And performance always collapses. Week 6, schedule your integration therapy. Find someone trained in shadow work. Book 3 sessions. Show up ready to stop performing. This is the hardest component, because it requires admitting you need help with the very thing you're supposed to be good at: helping. But the wounded healers who refuse help are the ones who end up like Friedrich, catatonic, finished, done. Month 3, you'll notice something strange. You'll start caring less, not in a depressed way, in a boundaried way. Things that used to devastate you will feel manageable. People who used to drain you will seem less important, and you'll feel guilty about this, like you're losing your empathy. You're not. You're losing your codependency, your merger, your shadow compensation. And what's emerging in its place is differentiated empathy, the kind that can last decades instead of months. Month 6, if you've been consistent with all 4 components, your nervous system will have reorganized, not dramatically, subtly. You'll sleep better, recover faster, feel less chronically exhausted, and most importantly, you'll notice that you can hold space without absorbing, feel with without becoming, care without carrying. This is what integration looks like. Not detachment, not numbness. Presence with boundaries, connection with differentiation, empathy. Without explosion. By month 12, you'll be a completely different kind of empath, not because you changed your nature, because you stopped denying half of it. The shadow half, the selfish half, the limited half, and paradoxically, accepting your limits makes you more effective, not less, because you're no longer leaking energy through suppression. You're no longer accumulating darkness that will eventually explode. You're processing in real time, which means you can show up consistently for years, for decades, without the 18 to 24-month collapse cycle that Jung documented and Huberman proved. This is the promise of integration, not infinite empathy, sustainable empathy, not martyrdom, mastery, not explosion, evolution. There's one final case I need to tell you about. It's not in Huberman's published study. It's in his personal notes that a colleague leaked. A participant who went through complete empathic collapse, refused the integration protocol, said it was too hard, too time-consuming, too selfish, spent 2 years in complete shutdown, no empathy, no connection, functionally depressed. And then something happened. She had a dream. She was drowning. And instead of someone saving her, she saved herself, swam to shore. And when she woke up, something had shifted. She started the protocol, not because anyone forced her, because she finally understood that self-abandonment dressed as empathy isn't virtue, it's violence against yourself. And she did all 4 components: daily shadow work, bi-weekly boundaries, monthly rage, quarterly therapy, for 18 months, and her empathy came back, different, boundaried, integrated. She described it as feeling like she could finally breathe while caring. Before, caring meant suffocating, absorbing until she drowned. Now caring meant choosing, presence without merger. And when Huberman's team scanned her brain at month 18, they saw something remarkable. Not just recovery, reorganization. Her amygdala was more active than ever, but it was connected to the prefrontal cortex, to the anterior cingulate, to the insula. The whole empathy network was online and integrated. They called it post-traumatic growth at the neurological level. Carl Jung would have called it individuation. The journey from unconscious empathy that destroys you to conscious empathy that differentiates you. That's what's possible when you stop running from your shadow and start integrating it. When you stop believing that empathy means limitless absorption and start understanding that empathy requires ruthless boundaries. When you stop performing goodness and start becoming whole. Jung saw it in 1928. Huberman proved it in 2022. And you can choose it today. The protocol is clear. The timeline is defined. The outcome is documented. 91% prevention rate for empathic collapse. Not through suppression, through integration. The only question left is whether you'll do it before you explode or after, because the explosion is coming. Jung's data and Huberman's neuroscience both guarantee it. The only variable is whether you'll see it coming and integrate your way through it, or whether you'll deny until you collapse and spend years trying to come back from defensive neuroplasticity. The wounded healer archetype exists for a reason, not to glorify suffering, but to warn you that healing others without healing yourself is the fastest path to becoming what you're trying to heal. Choose differently. One last thing, comment. Below, team overflow. If you've already hit the empathic breaking point and you're trying to come back. Or team absorbing, if you recognize the early warning signs, but you're still holding it together. Because the first step to integration is honesty. And honesty starts with admitting where you actually are, not where you're supposed to be, where you are, right now. With all the shadow, all the resentment, all the limits you're not supposed to have. That admission, that simple act of public honesty, that's already shadow work, that's already integration, and it might be the beginning of the differentiation that saves you from the explosion that destroyed Friedrich, that almost destroyed Ashley, and that's waiting for every empath who refuses to acknowledge that they too have a shadow that needs light.